There is a quiet, heavy emotion that lacks a neat label, yet almost anyone who has lived long enough knows its exact weight. It visits in the stillness of late night or during the silence of an ordinary afternoon. Suddenly, you look back across the landscape of your life, and the math simply fails to add up. You remember the choices driven by fear, the precious seasons lost to addiction, grief, toxic relationships, or the hollow routine of merely going through the motions of a life you never truly chose. You think of the years spent waiting for a promise that never arrived, or running frantically from a truth you should have faced. And somewhere in the quiet ledger of those thoughts, a single sentence takes root. Those years are gone, and I can never get them back. This message is meant for anyone who has been visited by that sentence. Scripture actually has far more to say about wasted years than most people realize, and what it reveals is radically different from what you might expect. It does not offer a stern lecture on how to better manage your remaining days. It does not hand you a self-help checklist to repair your broken past. Nor does it promise that if your faith is strong enough, a cosmic rewind button will suddenly appear to give you a clean slate. Instead, the Bible offers something far older, stranger, and exponentially more hopeful. To understand this, we must first establish a vital truth. Scripture does not view time the way modern culture does. We tend to visualize time as a rigid, straight line. The past lies fixed and unchangeable behind us. The present is the narrow ledge where we currently stand. The future stretches open ahead. Under this linear view, anything lost to the past is permanently gone, because you simply cannot travel backward on a one-way path. However, the ancient Hebrew worldview, the perspective of the authors of Scripture, was fundamentally different. To them, time was not merely a metric to be measured, it was a space to be inhabited. More importantly, God was not trapped inside the timeline, marching forward second by second alongside us. He stands above time, sovereignly holding every moment simultaneously. This is why Psalm 90, written by Moses, declares, "1,000 years in your sight are like a day that has just gone by, or like a watch in the night." Moses was not offering a poetic abstraction. He was making a profound theological claim. God's relationship to time is entirely different from ours. He is never constrained by what has already slipped away. And when God makes a promise specifically concerning lost time, it carries an authority that no human promise ever could. With that foundation set, let us look at the most explicit biblical promise regarding lost seasons. The Old Testament book of Joel opens in the wake of a catastrophic disaster. A devastating locust plague has swept across Israel, not in a single wave, but in 4 consecutive waves of destruction. Joel uses 4 distinct Hebrew terms to describe the invaders: the swarming locust, the hopping locust, the destroying locust, and the cutting locust. Each wave devoured whatever the previous one had left behind, leaving the fields stripped bare down to the soil. The harvest was shattered, the vineyards were ruined, and the granaries stood empty. In a single brutal season, the economic foundation of the entire nation was consumed. For an ancient agrarian society, this was not merely a temporary financial crisis, it was a total existential threat. An entire community watched helplessly as the very soil that sustained their lives was transformed into a barren wasteland. Yet, into the heart of that specific devastation, God speaks a breathtaking promise in Joel 2:25. "I will restore to you the years that the swarming locust has eaten, the hopping locust, the destroying locust, and the cutting locust." Notice the precise wording of his promise. God does not merely promise new crops for the coming year or a bountiful harvest down the road. He promises to restore the years. The very time that seemed devoured, irredeemable, and permanently swallowed by tragedy. God declares that he will restore it. Here lies the crucial detail that most people overlook. The Hebrew word translated as restore, in this context, is rooted in shalom. Specifically, its active verb form, shalom. While we often associate shalom with peaceful tranquility or emotional calm, its verb form carries a distinct legal and covenantal meaning in Scripture. It refers to making restitution, settling a debt, or compensating someone fully until the account is entirely made whole. This is not a promise that God will turn back the clock or erase history. Rather, it is a guarantee that God will make the final account complete. What was devoured will be fully compensated, not by handing you back the identical calendar years, but by filling your remaining life with a depth, purpose, and abundance that accounts for everything you lost. The locust years are not deleted from Israel's history. The fields truly were stripped bare. But God promises, I will make the ultimate outcome whole anyway. The final chapter of your life will not be dictated by what was taken, because I am the God who pays back what was lost. That is a far greater promise than a simple do-over. A do-over relies entirely on your ability to make better choices the second time. This promise stands firm because it relies entirely on God's power to redeem. Before moving further, let us re-examine the word wasted. When we describe certain years as wasted, we usually mean one of two things. Either those years were squandered by our own choices, sin, addiction, fear, procrastination, and we carry the crushing weight of guilt, or those years were stolen by circumstances beyond our control, illness, betrayal, trauma, or loss, and we feel deeply robbed. Both painful realities deserve honest acknowledgement. Yet classifying a season as purely wasted rests on an assumption that Scripture consistently rejects: the idea that time spent in the wrong direction yields nothing that God can use, that it is a total loss with zero spiritual value. Consider the famous parable of the prodigal son. The younger brother demanded his inheritance early, a cultural insult equivalent to telling his father he wished he were dead. He traveled to a distant land and squandered everything on foolish, chaotic living, eventually finding himself broke, starving, and feeding swine in a muddy pit. By any human calculation, those were wasted years, wasted resources, and wasted potential. Yet look closely at what happened when he finally turned back. His father saw him from a long way off, meaning the father had been actively scanning the horizon, watching for his return. The grand celebration that followed, the finest robe, the family ring, the fattened calf, was not an impulse. The father had not spent those lonely years in bitterness. He spent them waiting. Moreover, the son who walked back up that driveway was not the same naive young man who had left. The far country had shattered his arrogance. It had taught him the profound difference between a mercenary servant and a beloved son. He learned firsthand that he could hit absolute rock bottom and still be embraced by unconditional grace. He could never have acquired that deep humility while sitting comfortably at home. The far country was painful, but it was not pointless. Those hard years became an indelible part of his story, transforming him into a man who could finally appreciate and honor his father's house. The real question is not whether your past years were messy or painful. The true question is, what kind of God is waiting for you at the end of them? Consider the story of Moses, one of the most compelling examples of divine restoration in Scripture. At 40 years old, Moses experienced a total collapse of his life. Raised in Pharaoh's royal palace, he possessed elite education, wealth, and status. Aware of his calling to liberate his people, he attempted to take matters into his own hands by killing an Egyptian guard who was beating a Hebrew slave. The next day, when he tried to settle a dispute between two Israelites, one challenged him, "Are you going to kill me like you killed the Egyptian?" Word reached Pharaoh, and Moses fled for his life. In a single moment, everything he had built vanished: his political access, his leadership credibility, and his royal future. He escaped into the remote desert of Midian, married, and took a humble job tending his father-in-law's sheep. He spent the next 40 years doing that exact same low-level work. From age 40 to 80, Moses walked behind sheep in the dusty wilderness. By any logical standard, Moses had squandered his prime. His golden window of opportunity had slammed shut. He was no longer a rising leader with bright potential. He was an elderly man managing someone else's livestock in obscurity, waiting to fade away. And yet, At 80 years old, God appeared to him in a burning bush. Exodus 7:7 explicitly notes, Moses was 80 years old and Aaron 83 when they spoke to Pharaoh. Think about that. Moses' greatest life work, confronting the world's most powerful empire, parting the Red Sea, delivering 2 million people, receiving the law, and building the tabernacle, had not even begun. Until he was 80, he still had 40 full years of historic, nation-shaping ministry ahead of him. Furthermore, those 40 years in the desert produced something inside Moses that 40 years in an Egyptian palace never could have built. Moses emerged from the wilderness, knowing how to navigate it. He understood the terrain, the locations of hidden water sources, the brutal heat, and the harsh climate. When 2 million people needed to be led through that very same wilderness for 40 years, God needed a leader who had spent 4 decades learning every inch of the land. The time Moses spent tending sheep in Midian was not wasted time waiting to be erased. It was a divine curriculum. It was intense preparation for a mission so specialized that virtually no one else on earth was qualified to fulfill it. What felt like 40 years of failure was actually the quiet forging of the deliverer. Take a moment to honestly reflect on this question. When you look back at the seasons you consider wasted, what did you gain from them that you could not have acquired any other way? Not what you wish you could undo, nor the heavy price you paid, but what resilience, empathy, or self-knowledge was forged in you through those trials that a comfortable, easy path never could have produced. The Apostle Paul writes in Romans 5 that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance produces character, and character produces hope. This is not a romanticization of pain. It is a profound declaration that when suffering is placed in the hands of a sovereign God, it is never sterile. It does not merely subtract from your life and leave an empty void. It deposits something deep within your soul, even if it takes years to recognize it. A person who spent a decade battling addiction and emerged on the other side understands grace, weakness, and redemption in ways a person who was never tested simply cannot grasp. Someone who survived years in a broken marriage or a failed pursuit carries a depth of endurance and clarity that comfort could never construct. This theology does not praise suffering. It simply refuses to let suffering have the final word. This same perspective inspired Psalm 23, where David wrote, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death," notice he says, through the valley, not around it, and not merely looking back at it from a safe distance. The dark valley was an essential part of the path, not an accidental detour. The crucial issue is not whether hard seasons leave an imprint, but whether you will give God permission to use what those seasons built inside you. However, we must address a crucial condition clearly. This theology of divine restoration is never an excuse for present passivity. It is not permission to stay on a destructive path under the lazy assumption that God will automatically fix everything later. The prodigal son's father ran out to embrace him, but the son had to make the decision to turn around first. He had to pick himself up out of the mud and start walking home. In Joel 2 verses 12 through 13, right before God promises to restore the eaten years, he calls out to the people, "Return to me with all your heart, with fasting and weeping and mourning." The sequence is vital. The promise of restoration in verse 25 comes after the invitation to return in verses 12 and 13. Restoration is not something God forces upon those who are actively walking away from Him. It is what He pours out upon those who turn back toward Him, even if their legs are trembling, and even if they carry a heavy burden of regret. The first step belongs to you, yet that step does not need to be polished, fearless, or eloquent. The prodigal son had only a half-baked, stuttering apology prepared when his father interrupted him with a hug. God does not demand perfection. He looks for direction. Simply turning toward Him is enough for Him to meet you on the road. So let us bring this home to where you stand today. If you are carrying the grief of lost time, Scripture offers you something far more tangible than an impossible rewind button. God promises to make your account whole. He may not hand back those exact calendar years, but He guarantees that what remains of your life can bear a richness and purpose that far outweighs what was lost. The final verdict of your life will not be written by the locusts. The wilderness years Moses spent in Midian became the exact survival knowledge needed to rescue a nation. The years David spent hiding in dark caves produced the worshipful psalms that have sustained millions through grief across centuries. The years Joseph spent trapped in a dungeon grew the wisdom and humility needed to save the ancient world from famine. What will your past years become? That depends on what you entrust to God today. The past cannot be edited, but its ultimate meaning is far from settled, in the hands of the God of Shalom. Your past is not a permanent sentence of failure. It is raw, unfinished material waiting for redemption. Moses was 80 years old, tending sheep on the far side of a desert, when a bush burst into flame without being consumed. 40 long years had passed since his world fell apart in Egypt. He was no longer young, strong, or influential. Yet when he saw the fire, he made a simple, pivotal choice recorded in Scripture. He turned aside to look. He could have kept walking. He could have been so consumed by bitter regret that he ignored the wonder right in front of him. But he turned aside, and in that single moment, 40 years of dry desert wandering were transformed into the blueprint for 40 years of historic redemption. You do not know what divine purpose is burning at the edge of your life right now. You do not know what extraordinary future is waiting at the precise place where you choose to pay attention. The locusts ate what they ate, that is undeniable. But the God of restoration takes what was stripped bare and cultivates a profound harvest from the very ground you thought was dead. Turn aside, the bush is burning.